My name is Nora Ellis. I turned 30 on a Thursday in October, at a table my mother had reserved for 6 at her favorite Italian place, candles already lit on a slice of tiramisu, when I got up to use the restroom and came back one step sooner than anyone expected. My mother, Carol, was leaning across the table toward my father, her hand half covering her mouth the way people do when they think a whisper is quieter than it is. I heard 6 words clearly before either of them noticed me standing there. Have Tyler changed the locks? Today. Tyler is my younger brother. The only apartment either of them could have meant was mine. I sat back down, ate the tiramisu, let them sing happy birthday, and said nothing, because I needed to understand what I'd just heard before I let anyone know I'd heard it at all. What I found over the following 6 weeks wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan that had been assembled quietly, with paperwork for longer than I wanted to believe, aimed at something I didn't even know was fully mine yet, on the exact day it was supposed to become mine for good. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the quiet ones finally stop pretending they didn't hear what they heard. If you've ever caught your family planning something about you instead of with you, this one's for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe because nothing about this ends the way that Whisper wanted it to. Let me take you back to why that apartment not mattered so much, and to the grandmother who left it to me in the first place. My grandmother Vivian raised me for most weekdays growing up, while my parents worked in a rent-controlled one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a walk-up in the same city I still live in. The kind of apartment where the radiator clanked all winter and the fire escape looked out over a bakery that filled the whole building with the smell of bread by 6 a.m. She bought that apartment outright in 1988, back when the building converted to co-op ownership and long-term tenants got first right of purchase at a price that seems almost fictional now. She lived in it until she died 2 years ago at 84, and she left it to me in her will. I want to be honest that I wasn't the obvious choice on paper. My brother Tyler is more conventionally settled. Married, 2 kids, a mortgage he's proud of. I was, at the time Vivian wrote her will 6 years before she died, 22 and directionless in the specific way 22-year-olds are allowed to be, waiting tables and half finishing a degree. Vivian used to say I reminded her of herself at that age, which she meant as the highest compliment she had. The will, when it was read, included a condition that made sense to me even through the grief. The apartment would pass into a trust, managed by my parents as co-trustees, until I turned 30, at which point full ownership would transfer to me outright. She wanted, her attorney explained, to give me I'm to grow into the responsibility rather than hand a 24-year-old a paid-off apartment in a hot market with no guardrails. I didn't argue with it. It felt at the time like something she'd earned the right to decide. For the past 2 years since her death, I've lived in that apartment and paid what the trust document called nominal rent. $600 a month, well under market, meant to go toward maintenance fees, taxes, and a reserve fund the trust was supposed to build for the eventual transfer. My parents, as trustees, collected that rent and handled the building's monthly co-op fees. I never asked to see the accounting. That's the detail I keep returning to now, the one that makes this partly my own blind spot and not only theirs. For 2 years, I paid rent into an account I never once asked to look inside, because I trusted the people managing it more than I'd ever thought to verify them. My 30th birthday was the date the trust document specified for the transfer to complete automatically, no further action required, full title reverting to me the same day I turned 30. I'd circled it mentally for months, less out of impatience and more out of a quiet, private anticipation. The last piece of my grandmother finally fully mine, no asterisks attached. I did not expect that same date to be the day I'd overhear my mother plotting to have my brother change my locks. I didn't confront her at the table. I've learned, the hard way, that confrontin' my mother in public gets you a performance, not an answer, so I finished dinner, hugged everyone good night, and drove straight to my apartment instead of home, telling myself I was being paranoid, that there was probably some boring explanation, a maintenance issue, a lock that had been sticking, something ordinary. The building's night doorman Hector, who'd known me since I was a kid visiting Vivian, told me Tyler had been by twice that week already, both times while I was at work, both times with a woman I didn't recognize, and on the second visit, several taped moving boxes. Hector assumed I knew. He apologized for assuming wrong when my face told him otherwise. I let myself into my own apartment that night with the shaking, specific dread of someone checking whether something they love is still where they left it. It was. Nothing had physically changed yet. But in the kitchen, on the counter where I don't leave things, sat a folder I didn't recognize, printed floor plans of the apartment with measurements marked in blue pen, a crib positioned in what is currently my home office, and a sticky note in my mother's handwriting that said only, "Confirm W management by free." I sat on my own kitchen floor for a long time with that folder in my lap, the specific vertigo of realizing a plan for your life has already been drawn up by people who didn't think you needed to be in the room for it. I called Tyler the next morning, calm on purpose, and asked him directly what was going on. He didn't lie well, which told me he hadn't expected to need to. He said Mom and Dad had told him the apartment was, basically, already his, that with a second baby coming and rent prices where they were, it made sense for the family, and that they'd said I was still figuring things out and wouldn't mind once it was explained properly. He seemed genuinely confused by my confusion, which was its own kind of answer. This had clearly been discussed at length among the three of them, with me positioned as the last person who needed to know rather than the first. I asked him if he knew the transfer date on the trust. He didn't. That was the moment I understood my parents hadn't just failed to loop me in. They'd failed to loop Tyler in on the actual legal reality too, and were operating on a version of events that existed only inside their own house. I called the trust's attorney of record next, a man named Gerald Voss, whose name I only knew from the original paperwork I'd been handed at the will reading and had, embarrassingly, never contacted directly in 2 years. His office told me he'd retired 18 months earlier and the file had been transferred, and it took 3 more calls to learn who to. The trust's new attorney of record was a man named Philip Renner, whose office was in the same small suburban plaza as my father's insurance agency. When I looked him up that night, one line on his firm's own website answered the question I hadn't known I needed to ask. Philip Renner was my father's college roommate. I want to be fair here, because a family friend serving as an attorney isn't automatically evidence of anything wrong. Plenty of families use a trusted attorney they know personally, but when I called Renner's office directly, identifying myself as the trust's beneficiary and asking for a current accounting of the trust account, his assistant told me, politely but firmly, that requests needed to go through the trustees, meaning my parents, not through me, which was, I learned later from an attorney of my own, not actually how beneficiary rights work under state trust law, but which sounded official enough that it stopped me cold for exactly 3 days while I tried again to just ask my parents directly. My mother, when I finally called her and asked her plainly what the folder on my counter meant, didn't deny any of it. She said what she always says when confronted, which is to reframe the confrontation as my overreaction rather than her behavior. "Nobody's kicking you out tonight, Nora. Don't be dramatic. We just think, realistically, with Tyler's family growing, it makes more sense for them to have the space, and you're young, you can find another place easily. Your grandmother would understand family taking care of family." I asked her, directly, whether she understood that the trust legally transferred the apartment to me, outright, on my 30th birthday, with no discretion left for trustees to redirect it anyway, else. There was a pause on the line that told me she either hadn't known that detail as clearly as she should have, or had known it and was hoping I didn't. I hired an attorney of my own the next week, a probate specialist named Dana Ibarra, who read through the trust documents I'd finally requested formally in writing, citing my legal right as beneficiary to a full accounting. What arrived 12 days later, after 2 follow-up letters from Dana's office, wasn't reassuring. The trust's 2-year financial history showed the $600 a month I'd paid faithfully every month had been deposited correctly into the trust account, and then withdrawn almost as quickly, month after month, not toward the co-op's maintenance fees or a transfer reserve as the trust document required, but transferred out in irregular amounts to an account belonging to Tyler's landscaping business, memo lines reading things like trustee family support, and in one instance, simply loan. Dana explained what this meant in terms I could actually sit with. Trustees managing money outside the explicit terms of a trust document, even with good intentions, even to help another family member, is a breach of fiduciary duty, and depending on the amounts, could expose my parents to real legal consequences if I chose to pursue it formally rather than resolve it privately. I didn't want my parents in legal trouble. I wanted my apartment honestly documented, and the truth acknowledged instead of negate around me. But I also understood, sitting in Dana's office with 2 years of bank statements spread across the table, that not wanting trouble and letting this go quietly were not actually the same choice, because letting it go quietly was exactly what they were counting on. The confrontation, when it finally happened, wasn't at a restaurant. It was in my parents' living room, the three of us and Dana on speakerphone, my father mostly silent, the way he'd been silent through most of the big moments of my adult life, my mother doing most of the talking, alternating between defending the transfers as helping family and insisting the amounts were smaller than the statements showed, until Dana, calmly, read the actual total out loud: 14 months of rent payments, over $8,000, diverted to Tyler's business account instead of the trust reserve the document required. My father spoke only once, and it was the sentence that told me the most about where this had really come from. "I told her this was going to come out eventually," he said quietly, not looking at either of us, meaning my mother. "I told her. It wasn't an apology. But it was the first honest thing anyone had said in that room all night, and it told me my father had known and gone along with it anyway, which somehow landed harder than if he'd simply never known at all. What came out over the following weeks, slower and more complicated than I expected, was the actual why behind it. Tyler's landscaping business had been struggling for over a year. A bad commercial contract, an injured employee's workers' comp claim, a second baby on the way with a wife who'd had to leave her own job for medical reasons. My mother hadn't set out to steal an apartment from me out of malice. She'd watched one child visibly struggling and one child, in her eyes, coasting comfortably in a rent-controlled unit she hadn't technically earned, and she'd made a decision quietly over many months that redistributing what she saw as an unequal windfall was simply fair mothering, the kind of decision she assumed she was still entitled to make on my behalf, even though I was 30 years old, and the legal owner of the property in question. I understood the impulse even as I couldn't accept what she'd done with it. That's the part of this that still sits strangely in me. She wasn't a cartoon villain rubbing her hands together. She was a mother trying to solve a crisis, using a resource that had simply, legally, stopped being hers to allocate the day my grandmother signed that trust document, a fact she'd apparently decided didn't need to change how she behaved. The transfer date came and went in the middle of all of this, almost anticlimactically. My 30th birthday had already passed by 2 weeks by the time the accounting fight was underway, and Dana confirmed the ownership had transferred automatically as written. Regardless of the dispute over the misuse rent funds, the apartment was legally, unambiguously, entirely mine, and had been since the exact hour I turned 30, whether or not anyone had bothered to update the co-op board's records yet. Tyler had never moved in. The crib in the floor plan folder had never been more than a drawing. But the locks, I learned from Hector, had in fact been scheduled with the building's maintenance office for the Friday, after that whispered dinner conversation, an appointment my mother canceled herself, quietly, the day after I confronted her, before I even knew it had existed. Resolving the financial side took another 2 months, handled the way Dana and I agreed it should be handled, not through a lawsuit that would have publicly and permanently fractured the family, but through a formal, documented repayment agreement, my parents personally repaying the diverted rent funds directly to me over 18 months, in writing, notarized, with Dana's office holding the agreement rather than leaving it as another verbal promise I'd have no way to enforce later. My mother resigned as co-trustee the same week, a formality by then since the trust itself had already dissolved automatically at the transfer date, but one Dana insisted on for the record anyway, a clean closing of a chapter that needed one. Tyler and I had our own conversation, separate from our parents, sitting in his truck outside his kids' daycare because it was the only 20 minutes he had free that week. He apologized, and it was a real one, without the qualifiers my mother's apologies always carried. He said he hadn't asked where the money was coming from, because he'd needed it too badly to ask. The same sentence, almost word for word, I've now heard from more than one person in my life who benefited from something they knew, somewhere underneath, they probably shouldn't have looked at too closely. I helped him anyway, eventually on my own terms and my own timeline, not because I owed it to the family narrative my mother had built, but because Tyler is my brother and his kids are my niece and nephew, and separating what my mother did from what Tyler needed felt important to me. I connected him with a small business counselor through a program at the credit union I use, co-signed nothing, gave nothing beyond advice, and one afternoon helping him restructure an invoice system that was part of why his cash flow had gotten so bad in the first place. It wasn't dramatic, it didn't need to be. It was just useful, which is the kind of help I'd wanted someone to offer him from the beginning, instead of quietly redirecting mine. My mother and I are still working out what our relationship looks like now, 10 months later. She apologized once, briefly, in a way that still leaned more on explaining her reasoning than owning the harm, and I've decided I'm not going to keep waiting for a better version of that apology before I set the terms I need. I see her holidays. I don't discuss the apartment with her anymore, because there's nothing left to discuss. The repayment plan runs on autopilot through Dana's office, and the deed sits plainly, permanently, in a drawer with my name on it and no one else's. I moved a few things around in the apartment that fall, small changes, not because anything needed fixing, but because I wanted, finally, to make some decisions in that space that were entirely mine, uncomplicated by anyone else's plans for it. I turned the room my mother's floor plan had marked for a crib into an actual home office, the one I'd been using informally for years, and put up a shelf for the few things of Vivian's I'd kept, her chipped reading glasses, a recipe box in handwriting I still recognized before I recognized the recipes. I think about that whispered sentence at dinner more than I expected to, almost a year later. 6 words meant for my father's ears only that ended up being the thing that made an invisible plan visible before it could finish happening quietly. I don't think my mother has ever fully forgiven the accident of me standing up from that table 1 second too soon. I've made a kind of peace with the fact that she might not need to, that some relationships get smaller and steadier, rather than fully healed, and that both of those outcomes can still count as something worth calling family. I used to think loyalty meant not asking questions. I don't think that anymore. I think loyalty, the kind worth keeping, has to survive being asked a hard question honestly, and if it can't, tea was never as solid as it looked from across a birthday table. My apartment is mine now, on paper, and in every other way that matters, and the next time anyone in my family whispers something they don't want me to hear, I'll know at least that I'm capable of standing close enough to hear it, and steady enough to do something real with what I find. That's my story. One overheard sentence, one folder on a kitchen counter, and a trust document that told the truth louder than anyone's whispering ever could. If this reminded you that the people who raised you can still get something badly wrong, and that noticing it isn't betrayal, take that as your sign. Ask to see the paperwork. Trust what it says over what you're told. Thank you for watching Sweet Payback Stories. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.